Okay, so there's no obvious reason why he should be able to play that well while his hand looks that stiff, but there are reasons. I'm Tobias Murphy, and this is Murphy Music Academy. So today I want to do something a little bit different. I want to talk about something that it's not about technique today. It's tangentially related to your technique and it will affect your technique, but I'm not going to talk about any specific technique or even technique in general. Now, if you're watching this video and or are subscribed to this channel, and if you're not, you should go ahead and hit the subscribe button, then I could probably go ahead and assume that you are at least somewhat into violin, unless of course you're one of the members of my family that just subscribed because you're a member of my family, which I do appreciate. Once you are in violin for a long enough period of time, you are going to get to what I call the discovery phase, which is when you start to become aware and perhaps seek out recordings of the major pieces of violin repertoire. And with that, inevitably, you start to discover also the great violin performers. Now, as you might have been able to tell from that, I am personally partial to the older style of violin playing. As you can see by the giant CD box set, yes CDs, yes I am that old, of Heifetz that I have behind me here on my windowsill. But a lot of people I've noticed nowadays are very partial to Hilary Hahn or people like Ray Chen, whose success is not only due to their violin playing, but also due to their social media presence, even though, to be clear, both of them are extraordinary violinists. Now, having some kind of violinistic or even just artistic idol is extraordinarily important for anyone that wants to reach a really high level in whatever field of art or music or anything that they are pursuing. There's something about attaching yourself to a particular person or personality that kind of gets the ball rolling in your own inspiration. Now, I do think this is something that happens at a more, you could say, immature, and I don't mean this in a mean way, but an immature stage of development. Eventually, it's just the pursuit of the art itself and your conception of the art that you want to be pursuing. But a lot of people, in fact, I think most of us need to have someone that just sparks something in us, whether it's just the way they play or even just part of their own personality. As I mentioned, it's often very important for a lot of these violinists nowadays to have a strong social media presence for people to latch onto. That is so important. For my own experience, when I was first starting to get into violin playing, besides of course starting to listen to some of the older guys like Heifetz and Milstein, when I was 12 years old, I was really into Joshua Bell. Yes, I know you didn't know as much about him back then, but hey, if I didn't think he was so cool, which I actually did, I know it may sound a little bit weird, but 18 years ago, I thought he was the coolest thing ever, I would not have worked as hard, because I wanted to play Mendelssohn the way he played Mendelssohn. And if I didn't have such a man crush on the guy at the time, I wouldn't have made the level of progress that I did, jumping from somewhere like Suzuki Book 6 when I was 11 years old to playing the Mendelssohn Concerto at a pretty okay level by the time I was between 12 and 13. And if I hadn't learned the Mendelssohn Concerto at that age, then I probably wouldn't have learned all the rest of the major violin repertoire and won all the competitions I did throughout high school, which then led me to go on to conservatory and college, and then on to masters, and then on to postgrad, and also to the point where I am sitting here as a professional violinist and teacher, being able to dispense all of this knowledge to you. So basically, thanks, Joshua Bell. If it wasn't for you, on an abstract kind of, indirect way, I would not be here. The funny thing is, as it stands for my opinion of modern violinist, I'm much more of a bigger fan of somebody like Leonidas Kavakos than I am of somebody like Joshua Bell these days. But the importance of having some figure or multiple figures that just inspires you to work as hard as you possibly can and pursue as much as you can within your field. And for us and those of you watching this, which is music and violin, that is of incalculable importance, and it's something that even the best teacher can't just make you have. So, after all of that, you're probably wondering then, why, Tobiah, is this video called Why You Should Not Imitate Your Favorite Artists? The reason is that if you are at the stage where you are just starting to play major violin repertoire, or even have only been playing it for a few years, the chances are that your ability to accurately hear what your favorite artist is doing in terms of nuances of musicality, tone, and timing are incredibly inaccurate, and especially even more inaccurate is your ability to imitate those in your own playing. For a personal example, let's take Joshua Bell playing the Mendelssohn Concerto. Now, for those not familiar with the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, that section is all basically entirely just straight eighth notes, and you'll probably notice if you listen closely that he does take just a tiny bit of time at the bottom of each sequence. But when 13-year-old me tried to imitate this artistic expression, how else did it come out besides distorting the rhythmic integrity entirely? Essentially played that way for the entire piece, and let me tell you, my accompanists were way too accommodating. But screwing up rhythmic integrity is not the only mistake that you can make when you're trying to imitate or emulate your favorite artist without proper understanding. For example, let's take one of my personal current favorite violinists, Leonidas Kavakos. Now, for somebody that knows a lot about the ins and outs and all the intricacies of proper violin playing, there is so much to learn from watching his technique. However, if you aren't as familiar with that, I wouldn't go to him for an example of someone that I'd want to copy. A student that still has a lot to learn and is looking up to Leonidas Kavakos might think that they should, drop their elbow and kind of chicken wing their arm, and maybe not always keep the pinky on the string and sort of have the fingers sort of dangling down like this, and then maybe they'll sound like he does. Doesn't really work for me. Or we could take another example on the other extreme, Henrik Schering. Maybe Schering is the violinist you most look up to and you think, either consciously or subconsciously, I need to have my elbow up really high in order to be and play more like he does. Now, these are only a few and pretty egregious examples of what can happen when someone who doesn't understand enough tries to imitate or emulate their favorite artist, but it can go to more subtle things. It can go to, like I said earlier, timing. Maybe you're trying to match someone's vibrato and you really don't have as good a grasp on vibrato yourself. Maybe you're trying to imitate someone's musicality and it ends up just becoming either kind of fake or sometimes greatly exaggerated and a bit garish. You see, when someone like me watches Kavakos or watches Schering, from a technique fundamentals standpoint, I actually see them as doing basically the same thing. Kavakos and Schering have both what I would consider to be settled bow arms, wherein their right shoulder just sits very nicely without being raised at all by the trapezius muscle on top of their rib cage. The bow is primarily being supported by the strings on the violin. The actual bow hand's grip is very, very loose, and the path of the bow is primarily instigated from the elbow joint. You see, in violin, there are a bunch of codified fundamentals, or you might even think of them as platonic ideals of violin technique, things that every violinist needs to be trained in and to follow. Now, in the previous example with Kavakos and Schering, I showed how two people can be doing what seems to be entirely different things, But if you know what to look for, you can see that they are actually following the same fundamental principles. And of course, that was just in relation to their bow arms, which were the most obviously different things between the two of those players. But this can also go to just about every aspect of the violin, including even things just like your bow hand, your bow hold, how you approach what thumb position. If you want to know more about that, check out my thumb position video, what thumb position you decide to use when you play the violin. And this also goes out even to things like how you choose to approach musical phrasing. If perhaps when I was 13 and playing Mendelssohn, my teacher had been a little bit more strict about the rhythm, maybe I wouldn't have been able to be as expressive as I thought I wanted to be, but I would have been put much earlier on a path towards being more musically mature. You see, what I understand now that I didn't understand back then was when Joshua Bell was playing that section, and really, if you would have heard me play it, the entire Mendelssohn concerto, he already was starting out with a fundamental understanding of how the rhythm was supposed to go if you were going to go through it straight through, like with no nuance at all, with a metronome. He already was starting from that vantage point, and so he already has a conception of the piece rhythmically. And as a more mature artist, he is now able to take that and play with it in one way or another. Now, you could argue whether the way he's playing with it is the best idea or not. I may take a little bit of a different viewpoint of how he plays it now, but he is still coming at it from that ideal, that understanding, those fundamentals that you start with, that the rhythm is something that you have to pay full attention to, and that there is actually expression in having really good rhythm. And going back to technique, similar things apply to the left hand. For instance, there are fundamental rules about finger action. There are fundamental rules about the function of the thumb. Now, whether that takes the shape of the thumb being in the higher thumb position, a more under position, or maybe mixing up all of the different positions when depending on what you're playing, there are still fundamentals about how the fingers are supposed to be approaching the strings. So if you're a beginner or intermediate or just starting to get into advanced playing, what you need to do instead of finding someone that is your biggest inspiration and trying to imitate or emulate them, what you need to do is essentially be drilled through on all of these fundamentals of violin playing and music. You see, I am different from Kavakos, who is different from Joshua Bell, who is different from Hilary Hahn, who is different from Ray Chen. We're all different from Heifetz, as we all are very, very well aware, but each of us trying to follow the fundamentals of violin playing, the ideal, the platonic ideal of violin playing, will produce slightly different results in each person because we all have different bodies, and our bodies are going to need to do different things once we get to a certain level after we've been drilling in the fundamentals for a long enough period of time. For example, I give every single one of my students the exact same, and I mean literally the exact same, it's Sevchik Opus 1, left-hand exercises, and I give them the exact same advice in terms of how their finger action is supposed to work. But all of their hands end up looking slightly different because they all have different hands. Some people end up with a thumb position that is a little bit more of the high thumb position like that, and that works the best for them to get their hand position, their hand frame from first finger to fourth finger and be able to get a consistent finger action. Some people need a thumb position that ends up over here. Some people end up with a thumb position more like mine here. And here's the funny thing. Sometimes I do have to be like, maybe you should think about I try to guide them, maybe you should think about putting your thumb position a little bit over here, that might help you. But a lot of the times they just end up developing it themselves because as they are following the tried and true fundamentals, their body acclimates to where it needs to be. And the same is true of musicality. There are rules about phrasing, there are rules about tone production, there are rules about, tone color and rhythm and all of that other stuff. And those are things that as a young student you need to be drilled in and made to basically follow the rules on. And as you start to understand that stuff at a deeper level, that's when you start to come into your own and being able to take all of those fundamentals and make your own musicality out of it that now has some sense of structure. And the funny thing is, whenever you start to get a real true grasp on all of the fundamentals of both technique and musicality, that's actually the point in which you get the most out of watching your favorite great artists. you start to be able to see beyond the sort of obvious veneer of what their technique looks like and what they sound like, and start to be able to look beyond that and see all of the little nuances of how they take the rules of technique and manipulate them to work best for them, or they take the musicality and be able to manipulate it to make something that truly comes from their own heart. And then if you have an understanding of this, you can start to see, hey, I can see how they did that little thing and that's what works for them, but I can learn from how they manipulated that and then be able to figure out how to make something of similar worth work for myself. But if you haven't reached that level yet, what you need to do is still imbibe and listen to all of the recordings and videos of your favorite artist. Get inspired by them. Let them make you want to practice as much as possible so you can be as good as them, even if you aren't going to play exactly like them. But use that inspiration to drive you to practice the fundamentals so you become the kind of violinist that you were meant to be. A violinist that, no matter how they sound, no matter what shape their arms take when they bow or what type of thumb position they use, they drill these fundamentals because there was no pleasure in mediocrity. I'm Tobias Murphy from Murphy Music Academy. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.